Today I want to talk about a grand theory that diagnoses deteriorating human condition, points to its roots and to ways to stop it. The theory was constructed by Tony Wright, and I myself first heard of it through a video by Kerry McCarpet. This will be a response video directed to them both, in the hope of getting some clarifications and starting a discussion on the topic. My aim is not to trash the theory, I want to better understand it, and I would like some of my questions answered, of course. This will benefit the theory by fleshing it out or replacing non-working parts with something better. The theory that Tony Wright puts forward, as I understand it, goes like this. Fruits can be compared to sexual organs of flowery plants. Fruits have high concentrations of plant hormones. During the evolution of our species, people were eating a lot of fruit that was readily available in forests. In turn, humans and fruit-bearing plants formed a symbiotic relationship. DNA of evolving Homo sapiens was changed due to our ancestors eating so much of fruit that were rich in plant hormones and plant DNA. Because of this, people now have unusual cognitive abilities and an extended juvenile period. People are young for many more years than any other animal. For thousands of years we have been living outside of forests and on diets poorer in fruits but richer in grain, vegetables and other animals. We are not ingesting enough plant hormones that steer beneficial transcription of our DNA that helped build our big brains. Our brains are shrinking and we are losing great cognitive capacities. Further still, Tony says that we think with or are under control of the left hemisphere of our brains. Left hemisphere is said to be deceitful and less cognitively developed. Right hemisphere is better at some cool mental functions such as empathy and compassion, understanding context. Ancient traditions and practices, fruit-heavy diet, meditation, yoga, shamanic practices and psychedelics help to quiet the left hemisphere and activate the right. I'm skeptical of Tony's ideas and the idea that our shrinking brain is making us dumber or less compassionate. I'll start with some general thoughts and questions first. Our long-dead cousin Neanderthal had a very big head and brain. It was difficult for them to bear children. We also have quite big heads when we are born. Child and mother mortality during childbirth is high even today. Some of it could probably be attributed to complications caused by big heads. Could it be the case that natural selection favors animals with rather smaller heads because, well, they can at least survive childbirth more often than their brothers and sisters with larger heads? If fruit, was so readily available, it means our ancestors didn't have to struggle that much to get it. In effect, there wouldn't be much evolutionary pressure to get bigger brains, get smarter. If you have lots of food and therefore you live quite comfortably, then why bother with a big brain? Brain is a costly organ, it requires a lot of energy to operate. What use did people have from a bigger brain that paid this cost? Are other animals that eat only or mostly fruit also such that they have juvenile brains? If not, then why haven't fruits did to their brains what they presumably did to our brains? If frugivores are indeed a bit smarter and more compassionate than their herbivore or omnivore cousins, then why only a bit? What is missing? What is the difference between the evolutionary history of an orangutan and Homo sapiens? Tony needs to provide some evidence that when people were eating mostly fruit, they were indeed more compassionate and empathetic than today. I haven't seen any clues for this. To the contrary, Steven Pinker in his latest book Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress, paints a very different picture. We have less violence, less wars, less poverty than in any recorded time in history. We are healthier, we have more free time. In short, we seem to be getting better at being human. Couldn't much more animals benefit from fruit? Animals should have at least tried eating fruit that was supposedly more available. Then natural selection would favor such animals, and I would expect to see more smart animals that eat fruit or at least a lot of plants. I would not expect only a limited sample of species that benefited from such readily available food source. Movement. Homo sapiens is historically not a sedentary animal. It wandered, it scavenged, it often had to travel large distances to find food or to simply change its local environment. The connection between movement and the overall size of an animal and its head weren't addressed. Mike the Vegan puts forward an idea that connects the fact that nutritious food was in scarce quantities and it was necessary for humans to travel long distances. Mike calls it the Starch runner hypothesis.
Let's say by running from patch to patch, you can access an average of 500 plant calories per mile ran. That would just be an average. If you can run 100 miles in a day, which modern humans can, that gives you access to way more calories than if you were only able to run, say, 15 miles. That's 50,000 versus 7,500 calories. Minus the 100 or so calories we might burn per mile, and yes, starch is a way better running fuel than meat.
This is of course only an example. Evidence that I would like to see: groups of people that eat a range of foods, many fruits, moderate, small, no fruit at all. How do they differ in respect to the right brain functions? A prediction from the theory is that there should be differences between these groups of people. Also, it would be great to find groups of people that live in cultures that have different diets to check how the diet affects the developing brain in the womb and during childhood. Another good line of evidence I would like to see is archaeological evidence of hominids eating lots of fruit. This can range from some remnants of fruit near human settlements to analyses of fossilized human feces. On the other hand, we have evidence of human ancestors making fire and cooking food way before our species came to existence. The link to the article below. Tony would do good to deal with alternative explanations for the shrinking of the human brain. Such explanations are in the article linked by Kerry. Climate change. Last glacier period encompassed the period about 115,000 to about 11,700 years ago, straight from the Wikipedia page of Last Glacier Period. Now, I don't know what vegetation was growing then and how much access to food we had, but couldn't the climate change be a contributor to having bigger heads? I don't know if such is the case, but I would hypothesize that it might have been easier to have a bigger head in a colder climate than in warmer climate. Maybe something else changed after the last glacier period. Selection against aggression. According to Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard University, less aggressive species have smaller brains. It happened to 30 domesticated species of animals. They lost 10 to 15% of brain size. A fine example is the comparison of chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees are very violent, to a degree that they even murder other groups. On the other hand, bonobos virtually never resolve conflicts by violence. Bonobo brain is smaller by about 20% than that of a chimp. Moreover, such domesticated animals think differently. Wolves are better at solving problems on their own, while dogs simply use humans to solve problems for them. Energy efficiency. Brain is a costly organ. The bigger the brain, the more energy is required for it to function. So it may be the case that evolution simply optimized the brain. It became smaller while still conserving quality functionality intact. John Hawkes, the scientist that found that the brain is shrinking in volume, sees this explanation as very plausible. Population density. The more densely packed groups of people, the bigger drops in brain volume. Populations started getting larger around the time where we observed the brain shrinkage. It is quite possible that people could go away with larger brains and instead survive based on cooperation, protection by the group, rather than brute survival skills. This, however, does not mean that people are less intelligent, but rather that they are intelligent in a different way. What does Tony's fruit theory explain or explain better than those mentioned above? How is it better? Okay, so now I will try to respond to direct claims made by Tony. Here we go.
There's this split brain data, what each side of the brain does, and the fact that we're locked into looking at these problems with one side of our brain, yet the data on that side of the brain suggests maybe it's not something we should be trusting too much.
The claim. We think with our left hemisphere. In general, we think with both hemispheres. The two hemispheres have a lot in common, they also differ in some aspects. Language is strongly lateralized in the left side of the neocortex, but thinking and the whole richness of the human life is not only just production of speech. The claim is not sufficiently supported and the scientific evidence goes against it.
The kind of things that we call like, empathy, compassion, those things, the left hemisphere really doesn't have much of that anymore. It's also not too bright. It doesn't have very high cognitive function. It's quite frightened. Its perceptual abilities are quite limited.
The claim, people are losing some cool traits such as empathy, compassion, smarts. If our shrinking brain makes us dumber, then why are we getting more IQ? Look up Flynn effect. Basically, each generation of people is scoring more on IQ tests. The most reliable, the best test we have for ascertaining mental capacity. If our shrinking brain would entail us getting less smart, I should not be seeing people getting more intelligent, but I would predict we would be scoring less or at least the same on IQ tests as time progresses.
But I think when this starts entering the equation, start putting the brakes on that maturation process, slows everything down, which gives us an opportunity to build a bigger brain, but more importantly, I think, what kind of brain. And instead of a rapidly maturing brain, I think we ended up with an expanding brain that was increasingly immature, more childlike, particularly the new brain, the neocortex.
The claim, fruits allowed for the development of a big brain that can be juvenile for longer. I've already made a similar point, but again, how is this possible? Let's grant the point that there is an abundance of fruits in forests. Let's assume that plant hormones indeed change how human DNA is read to make proteins and build our brains. How does this transfer to the next generation?
So instead of being in this perpetual state of juvenility with all these amazing traits and abilities, our neural system begins to start reverting to a more primitive form, maturing more quickly.
The claim, instead of being in a state of perpetual juvenility, our brains started to degenerate. Evidence for human brain degeneration is missing. All I could find is that the size of the human skull has been shrinking for at least tens of thousands of years. That's not enough. This doesn't support the hypothesis that the brain is deteriorating in structure or function.
So this kicks in, forest gone, and this is where a lot of academia has been looking for answers as to how we built our brain. I think by the time we get here, it's the forest that built our brain. It's not that we can't survive here, it's tough. And there's evidence that humans, almost didn't make it at various points. If you're in an environment where the food's dropping off the tree, non-seasonal forest is usually buffered by hundreds of miles of tropical forest, so you don't have grassland, you don't have huge herds of grass-eating animals, so you don't have the massive predators. So deep in the forest, it's relatively benign. It's the kind of place this kind of thing could happen. If you're evolving a neural system that's not very aggressive, it's not very competitive, try to do it out here, and within 10 minutes you're going to get eaten. But in here, deep in the forest, there's not so much going to eat you. And with this new brain comes a lot of intelligence anyway, and the few things that are there can be dealt with. Once you get out here, very different. So the idea is the forest built our highly intelligent juvenile brain, then at some point the forest disappeared, but the brain, the heritage we had, we could survive here. But all the while the clock's ticking, this kind of cycle as it goes through the generations, we're losing the juvenility, more mature, more adult endocrine system is building a more adult brain, and that goes on and on through the generations and accelerates with time.
The claim, the brain had been built in the forest. The brain is still big and healthy tens of thousands of years after we left the forest. Why hasn't it degenerated faster? If we have almost no plant hormones from fruit, then we should see major changes in the development of our brains if the theory is right. Do we see major changes? Or only slight changes? Or no adverse changes at all? Also, Tony points out that in the forest there weren't many dangers to humans, but on the savannah there are many predators, so it means that in the forest there wasn't much of an evolutionary pressure to evolve big brains, because what use would we have for them?
There's parallels in insect-eating bats and fruit bats. Fruit bats tend to have larger brain and are seen as more intelligent. They're obviously limited as to what size of brain they can grow because of flight constrictions. And fruit eating generally seems to change the neural system. A lot of parrots eat a lot of fruit and they're regarded as highly intelligent. So there's a connection there that's not just with primates.
The claim, bats that eat fruit are regarded as smarter than insect-eating bats, and parrots that eat fruit are smart. So are squirrels and crows. In order to make a good point here, Tony would have to gather much more data. By that I mean compare a lot of animals that are somehow similar to each other but differ in what they eat. And by comparing I mean having some measure of being smart. Only then we could base this claim on empirical evidence.
Melatonin's also been tested for a contraceptive, quite effective. So we were pumping all these chemicals that inhibited the ancient estrous cycle, and our hormones were reinforcing that. And it starts to make sense of some of the mechanisms that would have emerged to deal with that, because this whole formula to build this unusual neural system and give us an unusual state of mind was kind of heading in the direction of very powerful contraception, which actually in terms of a species surviving isn't very helpful. It becomes a lethal kind of change if you can't breed.
The claim, our development will lead to more difficult breeding. Really, all the data we have are clearly showing that humans not only don't have problems with breeding or sustaining the species, but that the number of people is increasingly increasing. The most important factors that slow down procreation are availability of contraceptives, women's rights, higher standards of living.
Re-emergence of hierarchy and patriarchy, particularly male-dominated, isn't some kind of new social sort of structure. It's actually a symptom of neurological damage. As our neural systems begun to fail, these more primitive, aggressive traits have risen to the surface, and it's really driven by fear and control. You lose function, and the world becomes more frightening. There's more need for control, and that's exactly what you see sort of happening over the last few thousands of years.
The claim is that the change in diet allowed for testosterone to get more control of men, thus contributing to re-emergence of hierarchy and patriarchy. That is of course a fine claim, but what is missing is an argument as to why hierarchy and patriarchy are bad for our species or for individual people.
He was one of the early pioneers saying that the left hemisphere is basically deluded, it confabulates all the stuff I've already talked about, and the left hemisphere is also perceptually dominant. Now, of course, unless he's a special case, and he's never claimed to be, he must also be talking about his left hemisphere, inevitably. And yet, you don't see this, and I have got some clips if we've got time. So he's written all these books, he's talked about all this stuff, and then one of the clips I've got today, or it's online somewhere, he then goes on. In one clip, he's ridiculing the left hemisphere in a patient, how dysfunctional it is. And then he goes on later to defend the left hemisphere. Don't leave home without your left hemisphere. He's utterly unable to see the connection between his research and having a left hemisphere that's severely deluded.
The claim, Michael Gazzaniga, says that the left hemisphere is lying, but he himself doesn't see that he uses his own left hemisphere to interpret the research. Essentially, this claim is paradoxical. It is like saying, I am a liar. If this is true, then I am a liar and it was a lie. If I lied, then this statement is false, so it is true. It is a paradox. If you can laugh at Michael Gazzaniga for using his left brain, then why can't I laugh at your left brain for your interpretation of Gazaniga's research, using my own left brain, of course? If you are saying, using your left brain, that your left brain is lying, then are you telling the truth? In which case, back to the paradox. And the final thing, the takeaway from Gazaniga's research, is not that the left hemisphere is lying, but that it interprets the world the best it can. It provides a narrative. I link to a lecture where Gazaniga explains the concept of the interpreter, what he calls this mode of operation of our brains that is constantly construing explanations, narrative, and interpretation of the world. I would love to hear what you have to say about that. Feel free to make a video response, drop a comment, or even hit me on Twitter. Be sure to check out the links in the description. Till the next time.